everyone, welcome back to my sewing studio and to my channel. I am Lisa from Pink Holly Bush Designs, and here we discuss everything sewing and smocking. So today I have a quick little tutorial for you on a French binding. Now if you watched my spring 2022 sewing plans, and I'll put a little link to it if you want to go watch that, one of the things that I said I was planning on sewing is the Geneva blouse from Lisa & Co. And it's almost done. So I'm making it out of just this beautiful cotton rayon fabric, and it just has a very nice drape. I really like how it's turning out. Now the blouse is finished with bindings rather than facings, and it's giving a beautiful finish. But I started doing the binding for the neckline, and it turned out really lovely, but it was just a little bit fussier than I normally like it. And it uses a single binding where you turn the binding to meet the stitching and then turn it to the inside. You have to baste it. And I ended up just finishing it by hand because trying to top stitch, I wasn't catching it. Anyway, you also finish the sleeves the same way. So when I got to the sleeves, instead I used a French binding. A French binding, you're lining all the raw edges up, and then it's a double binding, so it's a little bit thicker, and that is the negative if you're using a thicker or a stiffer fabric. But on this very soft and lightweight rayon cotton, the French binding, the 2 layers, is just giving me more control. And so that's the way I did the sleeves. But first up, if you haven't subscribed, please do hit that subscribe button. Give this video the thumbs up. I appreciate it. It helps me to keep being able to produce these videos. So thanks so much, and let's look at the tutorial. So here's my original binding pattern piece. It's 1 inch wide by the length specified in the pattern for the size blouse I'm making. So what I did was I cut a new pattern piece, and this is 1 1/4 inches wide, again by the length specified in the pattern. Then I took that pattern piece and I sewed the short ends together and pressed them open, and then pressed the entire thing in half with the raw edges together. So now I've pinned the binding to the sleeve with all the raw edges together, and I'm going to go to my sewing machine, and I'm just going to use a regular straight stitch, and I'm going to stitch this together with 1/4 of a seam allowance, and the 1/4 inch is again the seam allowance specified in the pattern. Okay, so I've sewed my binding on with all the raw edges together with that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now I'm going to trim it down to 1/8. Trim this along. Okay, I've turned the blouse inside out. I've finished trimming the seam. I'm going to press the whole thing flat, and then I'm going to press the binding away from the seam. And I'm doing it inside out like this so that I can keep that seam allowance also pressing away from the seam, or from the sleeve, sorry. I'm just going to work my way around here. Now that I have it all pressed flat, and I have both the seam allowance and the binding pressed away from the sleeve, I'm now going to fold the binding back covering that seam allowance, and I'm folding it right on the seam, and I'm rolling it slightly to the wrong side so I can just see, I hope you can see that in the video, just a little edge of that right of the sleeve kind of showing, because I don't want any of the binding showing on the right side. And I'm going to press it, and you can either clip it or use pins, whichever you're more comfortable with. I'm using the clips because of what I'm going to do in the next step. So I'm just going to work my way around. Make sure to get one right here on where the sleeve seam is. Clips do make it hard to get my iron in there. All right, so there's my binding all in place. And the reason I wanted to use the clips is I'm now going to use a little bit of my glue based it to hold it right in place so that I can stitch it. The glue based it will wash out. It doesn't, won't clog your machine at all. It's a wonderful product. So and I'm just going to slip it right in here. And the important thing with this is to give it a couple minutes to set up. Don't be in a hurry to rush to the sewing machine, but let it really dry, and then it'll hold it. And then what I'm going to do is edge stitch the binding in place. Now, I'm going to do that from the wrong side because I have a machine that I am comfortable with the bobbin thread showing on the right side. If you don't like what your bobbin thread looks like, and you can top stitch this instead, measure and see, exactly how far you are, because you want to be catching this inside edge as close to it as you can. Going to give it a little bit more right here by that seam allowance, sleeve seam there. All right, I'm going to give that a minute to go set up, and then I'll meet you at the machine and show you how I'm going to edge stitch this closed. So I'm at my machine. I have my edge stitch foot on, and I have the needle shifted over 3 clicks so that I'm catching just the edge of this binding. And as you can see, I'm sewing from the wrong side. And I'm just going to go around catching that binding edge. And there's my finished binding. Now, I ended up with a binding that's only about 1/8 of an inch wide. If you wanted this to be more like 1/4 of an inch, then start with a 1.5 inch strip rather than the 1 1/4 inch strip that I started with. I hope you give this binding a try. Let me know in the comments if it works well for you, and happy sewing.